Hey, what's up, everybody? Mark MacKinnon here. Today, we are talking about Anime 5e character creation. I'm starting a new video series which is going to walk you through the different steps on creating a character. And today's session is the most important by far, and that is session 0. This is before the game begins. How do you create a character that's going to fit with the game that the Dungeon Master is running and that the players want to play? That's why we highly recommend using collective creation. So rather than creating a character in isolation by yourself, get together with the Dungeon Master and the other players so you can create characters at the same time. And this is going to give a party cohesion that's not going to be the same level if you play it individually. Now you can get together, of course, virtually or in person, whatever works for your group. And this is when you're going to set a lot of the parameters so that you're all on the same page moving forward, rather than kind of creating it in isolation and not really understanding what the other players are doing. Because it's really important that each character is going to shine in their area. That's not to say that, of course, you can't have 2 fighter types in a group or 2 magic using types in a group, or 3 or 4. But the collective creation makes sure that you can express your vision in a way that all the players are going to know where your area focus is. So even if you have 2 or 3 fighting type characters, a samurai and say a ninja, how they are going to interact and what their background story can be very, very different. So session 0, critical. During that session, you're going to determine with the Dungeon Master the starting level of the game. Because not every character is going to start at first level. I mean, that's certainly a great way to do it. It's one of my favorite ways to play, is you start at first level and you work up through the initial challenges, and then as you get more and more power, your power level goes up and up. But not everyone wants to start that way. Sometimes you want to jump in and start at 3rd level or 5th or 10th or even 20th level. And so during session 0, you're going to determine what the starting level is going to be. The starting level is important because it's going to determine the number of discretionary points you have. So unlike traditional 5th edition, there are points that are used in Anime 5e. And it's not a strictly point-based character creation system like, say, Besem 4th edition, our other anime role-playing game. It's a combination of a class and race-based along with points. And so discretionary points is a way to balance the different abilities that characters have versus other characters. So in a traditional 5th edition game, when I was in high school, you get your 3d6, you roll up your 6 ability scores, you assign them. If you happen to roll bad, oh well, you're going to be weaker than the other characters who rolled really well. If you're all getting 12s and 11s and someone else is getting 16s and 17s, you're just going to start out at a different imbalance. Even if you're all 1st level or 2nd level, those ability scores are critical. And so with discretionary points, this is a way to ensure that we have a balance between ability scores and powers or features that your character may have. And so every character starts with 80 discretionary points if you're starting at 1st level. Now, we recommend in the game that if you're starting above 1st level, that every additional level is going to give you 1 extra point. So if you're starting at 2nd level characters, you'd have 81, or 82 points if you're starting at 3rd level characters. Now, this is just a suggestion. The reason why we put this in is to account for all the magical items, the artifacts, the things that fall outside the class progression charts that you would have. Your treasure, perhaps, certainly the special things you're going to have, where it could be horses or armor or even houses or inns or businesses or whatever. And so while we recommend 1 point extra, you're Dungeon Master, and you can collectively decide that you want 2 points per level, 3 or 4 or 5, or whatever the amount is. But the base is going to be the same for every player. And from this discretionary point pool, let's talk about 80 points, 1st level characters. From this discretionary point pool, every player is going to pay for their ability scores, and they're going to play for their racial abilities that they have. Classes don't come from discretionary points. That's kind of a separate progression. It provides points as you go up in level by adding different features and benefits. But you're going to be paying out of your pool your ability scores and your race. Now, from those 80 points, you may use all of them up on ability scores alone and not have any points for race left. Or you may have some left over, or it could be in fact that you underspent and you have lots left over. If you've overspent, there's a way to get some of those points back. So the 80 is a fixed number, but you can play with it within that realm. And so the ability scores, when you generate them in the game, which is of course the next step, once you have your collective creation and you're going to be deciding on your discretionary points, then you're going to be rolling your ability scores. And the ability scores are paid for through your discretionary points at the cost of 1 discretionary point per ability score. So if you have 10s across the board, and your strength is 10, dexterity is 10, 10, 10, 10, 10, all across your 6, that is 60 discretionary points out of your 80 that you're spending on your ability scores. One thing we want to talk about when you're creating your ability scores, and this is part of the collective creation, are benchmarks. And it's really important that the dungeon master and the players understand where you want to have your kind of your level caps on not your class level, but on your ability levels or your feature levels. And the reason why, there's a lot more flexibility in Anime 5e than there is in standard 5th edition. So you can increase your armor class. For example, maybe you have a naturally hard skin, or maybe you can increase your movement abilities. It could be flight, or it could be like a special ability like a teleportation or something like that. And what the benchmarks are designed to do is to not have anyone outside of kind of a narrow box. So there's lots of flexibility. If you think of a traditional 5th edition game, you got your fighter and you got your wizard. And what they can do is very, very different. But you're not going to start a first level game, for example, with a fighter at, maybe a 24 strength. That's well outside the range. Or maybe in terms of armor class, like an armor class of 22 or 23. And you may be saying in 5th edition you can't do that, which is of course true, perhaps. In Anime 5e, you have a lot more flexibility, and you actually can put your discretionary points towards giving you some of these features which adjust your character in very focused ways. But the benchmarks and the table 1 that we have in Anime 5e is a way to make sure that no one kind of falls outside the box you're going to establish as saying, this is what's reasonable for characters at this level in our game. And so you're going to say maybe only one stat at 18, or an ability score. You can't go above an 18. Or maybe you can have no more than 2 over 17. Or whatever the parameters you want to have. The benchmarks that we suggest in Table 1 are just a guideline. And it's to give you an idea for balancing. Like all things in a role-playing game, dungeon masters and players can effectively throw the suggestions and the guidelines out the window and go with what's right for them. But benchmarks are a great way to establish that foundation. And so with the ability scores, when you're generating them, there's numerous different ways you can generate ability scores, and every group has their favorite way, whether it's rolling a straight 3d6 in order, so you roll 3d6 and that's your strength, and the next one's your dexterity and constitution, or it could be you roll 4d6, drop the lowest, assign it wherever you want, maybe there's a pool of dice. There's so many different ways of doing it, and what it comes down to, it doesn't matter what method you use to assign your ability scores, because you can either adjust them as you want to, and in fact, you're going to be paying through them with discretionary points, which means getting your 18 or your 17, while that gives you an advantage in that particular category over someone that has, say, a 12 strength, you're going to be paying the points, and thus you're going to have fewer points for something else. So an average character of 10 across the board is paying 60 points, or an above average character, maybe 12 across the board, and they're going to be paying 72. Well, that character who has the higher ability scores, they're going to have 12 fewer points to spend on your race and other features, which we call attributes in the game. And so it's designed to have a foundation of a point-based system and a point-based balancing. So when you're designing your ability scores, you can just buy them outright if that's what your group wants to do. So you just say, I want to have 13 strength, I want an 8 dex, I'm going to have an 18 intelligence. You can just choose, because it doesn't really matter how you generate them. They all come from your discretionary points. So with that pool of 80, you set it aside and pay your discretionary points for your ability scores. Now, if you want to choose a race that's in the book, and there's 14 different custom races, plus all the traditional 5th edition races, which we do provide points for, you're going to want to set aside some points to make sure that you can choose a race. You don't have to. You can choose raceless, which is not to say you're an amorphous blob that doesn't have a race. What we're saying is that the features that come with a particular race, they aren't going to be baked in to the point-based structure. So you can decide, I want to play, for example, an elf. or maybe you want to play an Azrai or a Hound or a Nekojin, a cat girl. You can choose any race you want, and the 14 races we present in the book all have points associated with them, but you can choose to say, well, I'm going to be a Nekojin, so I'm going to be a cat girl or cat boy, but I'm not going to take any of those baked in features that they have. And so you're going to be raceless. And we'll cover that a little bit more later. But the reason why it's important to mention about the race now, of course, even though it comes in a later step of character creation, is that determines what you're going to do with your ability scores regarding the number of points you have. Because if you spend them all on ability scores, then your selection of race points is going to be either minimal or non-existent. Now, as I mentioned earlier on, if you run out of points, there's a way to get some extras back, and that's through defects. Defects are kind of like, think of it like negative features. We call them defects. We have defects and attributes. Attributes are your positive features, and then defects are your negative ones. And what defects do, they provide you points back that you add back to your discretionary point pool to increase it above 80. So, if you have 80 and then you say you take a disadvantage, maybe your character isn't very good at combat, and so you're going to have a negative on all of your attacking rolls, for example, or you're going to have a disadvantage on your rolls. Well, you're going to get 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 points added to that 80-point pool so that now you can purchase additional ability scores or an additional more powerful race than you could afford otherwise, or you can turn them right back in and buy additional attributes. And that's something, again, we'll cover a little bit later, but these are your features that you're going to be looking at. And whether you're going to specialize in ability scores or specialize in a race with lots of different diverse abilities, or you're going to be adding on lots of attributes and defects, it doesn't make a difference to the game, provided you're within your benchmarks, and that you all agree on. But you're going to create the character that you want to create, and that's what's really important about the discretionary points. Once you kind of determine that, that's going to help set your framework for your character. What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? What are some of the motivations behind your character? And a lot of this comes from a great foundation that we included in the book called the Character Quiz. And these are a couple dozen questions that we recommend that everyone go through and answer, only briefly. It doesn't be paragraph form. But these are questions that are going to get you thinking about your character's motivation, your character's life, how your character is going to progress in the future. And it's not designed to be a rigid set of rules that you can't go outside what you've established, but it will give you a focus for your character. So if you know what motivates your character, if you know what your goals are for your character, and perhaps how your character views themselves in the party, and what your role in the group are. Maybe a little bit about your history, and about, are there anything you're afraid of? How do you view death and dying, and what are views on authority and perhaps religion, which can play a big part in a fantasy role-playing game, of course. And these are designed to give you inspirations, the things to think about, and if you can talk about them as part of the collective creation, but also with the game Dungeon Master directly, this will help kind of guide some storylines, some plot lines, and also give you a real strong understanding of what makes your character tick. Why are they adventuring? And this will give you that focus that you need to move forward. So we certainly recommend doing a character quiz type format and making sure your Dungeon Master has it. And of course, the other players can see it as well if there's nothing too secretive in there. Maybe you might want to keep 1 or 2 back that are something you want to spring on them later as a part of your backstory. But having all the players and the Dungeon Master understand your character and you understanding your character better will create a better role-playing experience. And of course, the final thing we want to talk about, making sure you get those ability scores down, you write them down on your character sheet, and you leave the additional, you count how many you have of additional discretionary points remaining, because that's going to play into your next choice. So that's just a brief understanding of what sessions zero in. It's the foundational aspect that's important for every single game before you start. Unless you're playing, say, a one-shot game at a game convention or at a retail store. But the session zero is the most important part of character creation because that's going to guide your future. And in an upcoming video, we're going to talk about your race selection and your class selection and how you can add those additional attributes and defects. So thanks for tuning in. We'll see you again.